Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for attending, both in person and on Zoom. Um, I'm thrilled to have Professor Alice Crowe here from FSU, but I'm going to steal a few minutes of her time because there is a bit of a hole in this series. Last week, Professor Kurta spoke about the Neolithic and the beginnings of agriculture in the Balkan Peninsula, and specifically Greece. The Neolithic in the Eastern Mediterranean, apart from perhaps earlier animal herding, is generally thought to have developed about 9 or 10,000 years ago. Today, we'll learn about the Bronze Age in that area, generally considered to have begun about 5,300 years ago. But what went on in that 4,000-year gap? Archaeologists have defined that interim as the Copper Age, or Chalcolithic, a time of emerging metallurgy and complex societies and larger settlements, long-distance trade. Metallurgy particularly flourished in the Balkans and on Cyprus, and Cyprus refers to the fact that there was copper found there. And people learned to refine and shape it into useful implements and decorations, though unalloyed copper is too soft for knives and weapons. Otzi, the Iceman discovered on an Italian mountaintop, was dated from 5,300 years ago, and he was carrying a copper axe. This was also the time of population movements out of Ice Age refuges in the mountains of Central Asia, including a people we call the Yamnaya, the parents of all Indo-European languages spoken today. I'll recruit a speaker on that topic for an ILR Wonder when I can find one. Don't hold your breath. But please do turn off your cell phones or silence them. Thank you so much for coming. So, Professor Alice Crowe, who drove from Tallahassee this morning to tell us about Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age, and we're very appreciative of her willingness to commit a whole day and several hours of driving to educate us on the topic. Dr. Crowe is an assistant professor in the Classics Department at FSU and an archaeologist who has been down and dirty on hands and knees exploring Bronze Age sites in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean littoral. Her research focuses on aspects of urbanism and its loss, collapse, and transformation, mortuary practices, and ceramic production and consumption. Her fieldwork and research focus has been especially on the Minoan Palace of Knossos in north-central Crete, although she has participated in fieldwork across the Eastern Mediterranean, including on early Neolithic sites. Professor Crowe took her PhD at the University of Cincinnati. Please welcome Professor Alice Crowe.
The mic is working? Great. All right, thank you for having me. I just moved to Florida in August, so this is my first time down to Gainesville, and it's great to have the opportunity to speak with you all about the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age and its collapse. I'm so fascinated by this time period because it's a period in which empires rise. There's big technological change with the invention of bronze. And this region is increasingly becoming interconnected. It's very multicultural milieu, connected by trade and exchange and the earliest diplomacy between these imperial powers. And it's good. Away. Closer. This, there's no one here? Yeah. You can hear? Okay, it seems like the back is good. It's too loud. Okay. Is that a little better? Okay, okay, great. Okay with everyone in the back? Great, all right. Okay, so what is the region and time period that we're gonna be looking at? I'm gonna focus on the late Bronze Age, which is about 1500 to 1200 BC, and this region over here. The main powers of the time period are Egypt, Pharaonic Egypt, so the time period of the New Kingdom. The pharaohs are buried in the Valley of the Kings, like King Tut, Ramses II. The Egyptian Empire, one of the main powers. The second main power is based in what is today Turkey, in the region of Anatolia, where the Hittite Empire rules from the central plain in Anatolia, way high up in the mountains, at the capital site of Hattusha, huge fortified citadel. And Egypt and the Hittite Empire are constantly fighting over territory. That's kind of the conflict that defines the period. The other main region is in the area of the Levant. So Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Syria area. Here, rather than an empire, we have small city-states, but very powerful and very interconnected with trade. And so the Hittites from Anatolia and Egypt are constantly fighting over these two regions. Another important region is Cyprus. This is the center for copper, for mining copper, and that is the main material in bronze. Bronze is what's driving interconnection in this time period. Other major powers on the periphery is in Mesopotamia, the Babylonian dynasty, and then way out, mostly where my research focuses, in Greece, where the Mycenaeans are ruling from a bunch of different palaces, the largest being at Mycenae, very like the Hittite capital at Hattusha, a stone fortified location, very wealthy, located on important trade routes. And what is driving the interconnection in this time period is the acquisition of raw materials. Raw materials to make prestige goods, jewelry, metal vessels, things that appear in the pharaohs of tombs. The main raw material that's driving trade is bronze. Bronze is what is used to make agricultural tools, any tool for craft production, and then importantly, weaponry. It is, in the prior age, stone is the main material for tools in the Neolithic that you were learning about last week. Now it's bronze. Copper plus tin is what gets you bronze in the ancient world, 10 parts copper, 1 part tin. The copper is coming from the island of Cyprus. Tin is coming all the way from Central Asia in Afghanistan. So that's really the material that requires the most labor to access. Other raw materials that people are trading for are timber, which comes from the area of Lebanon. That's important for constructing houses, for constructing tombs, for building ships. And shipping across the Mediterranean Sea is going to be the one way that you acquire these raw materials. Well, another would be by a donkey caravan. In fact, that's the way. So what I have up here are ingots. So that's the raw material. And they're in this oxide shape, what we call an oxide shape parallelogram, to make transport easier, to make it easier to tie on the side of a donkey and to stack up on a ship. Gold, Egypt has a monopoly on gold because of the control of mines both in Egypt and to the south in Nubia. Ivory, elephant ivory and hippo ivory is another prestigious raw material that people are after in this time period. So that's what's driving both conflict and connectivity in this period is the acquisition of raw materials. And I like to show this to highlight how this raw material actually gets used. This is an object, a piece of jewelry from an Egyptian tomb. And all of these stones are coming from different regions. The turquoise is coming from the Sinai Peninsula. The carnelian in red is coming from the Eastern Desert in Egypt. The gold is coming from the south in Nubia. And then some of this other blue material is something called lapis lazuli, which is coming all the way out from Afghanistan. So to produce this one piece of jewelry, you have to import materials from all over the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is, just one of thousands that are deposited in Egyptian tombs. Each of these regions has their own traditions, their own customs, their own language, their own ways of dressing. But even though they have their own script and language, they're also united by a lingua franca. Whenever rulers of these different empires are conducting diplomacy, They're all using the same language and writing in the same script. The script is a cuneiform script, and it records the Akkadian language that originated in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC. And it's written on clay tablets, like the one that you see up here on the right. And because it's made of clay, usually these texts will disintegrate. The only ways that we get them preserved is if the building, the archive that they were stored in, is accidentally burnt down, so that they're accidentally fired. In the Bronze Age, there are 3 main archives. One at Amarna in the southern part of Egypt. One at Ugarit, which is on the Syrian coast. And one up at Hattusha, the capital of that Hittite empire. So these texts are going to give us okay, back to short. So all of these powers are using one central diplomatic language to communicate. Out on the periphery, where I work, Greece does not speak that lingua franca, which is one of the ways that we know they're kind of a minor power on the periphery. They are speaking in the Greek language, an old version of the Greek that is spoken today. And they're writing in a script that we call Linear B. Their documents are all economic. They're all about taxation, counting sheep, how much property the palace owns. So from this region, we don't know much about political structure or about diplomatic interactions. Whereas for the rest of the world that's speaking Akkadian, we know a little bit about how emperors are communicating with each other. And the best evidence for correspondence between pharaohs and emperors of Mesopotamia, of Egypt, comes from this archive located at Amarna in Egypt. The archive is letters that were sent to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and letters that he sent outwards. Now, Akhenaten is an interesting pharaoh in that he moved the capital of Egypt from its historical location in Thebes, where it had been for 1,000 years, to a new site, a new city that he built in the middle of nowhere, very isolated in Middle Egypt. And he names the city after himself and builds it all anew. Subsequent pharaohs moved the capital back to Thebes. And so this city only existed for a period of about 10 years and was abandoned immediately after, with all of the contents of the city left behind, including this archive of the pharaoh and the letters that he wrote to other emperors like the Babylonians. So the archive includes correspondence between 2 groups of people, between equals, so someone that the pharaoh considers of equivalent power, an emperor from Mesopotamia, the Hittite king. And then the second group is people that the Egyptians oversaw. So city-states in the area of Syria that were vassal states for Egypt, so considered lesser beneath them. And they give us really unique testimony as to how rulers of the Bronze Age spoke to each other, what they were concerned about. What they're concerned about is alliances, especially marriage. We hear a lot about Mesopotamian princesses being sent to Egypt to solidify an alliance and what their dowry consisted of. We hear a lot about gifts that were exchanged because that is the material value of that you held the alliance in. How many gifts you're giving to a peer shows how much you actually valued that alliance. And we hear a lot of pettiness as well. Rulers are constantly concerned that they are not getting sufficient gifts back, that the women that they send as brides are not being treated correctly. And so these texts, there are about 400 of them, give us kind of fascinating testimony into their pettiness and also their more serious concerns. So I'm going to show you some of what these texts are. So any correspondence between equals always starts out with a formula that sounds kind of like our small talk today. When I read these, I always think this is kind of very similar to what my students send me in an email after ChatGPT has made a suggestion as to what the decorum for sending a professor an email is. So they always start out, I'm writing to, so this one is an example that the Babylonian king is, that the Egyptian pharaoh is sending a letter to the Babylonian king. And he always starts out and says, who I'm sending it to, who I am. And then he starts saying, I hope you are well. I hope your whole family is well. I hope your horses are well. I'm doing great. My kingdom is great. Don't worry about me. I'm doing well. My wives are doing well. My horses are doing well. And so every letter that you get in the Amarna archive starts out with this like small talk version for the first paragraph, your polite etiquette. And then we get into the serious stuff, because even though we say we wish you're well, we don't really necessarily. So the second thing, so one of their main concerns is about marriages, these marriage alliances and the dowries that go along with these marriages. And Egypt is kind of the oldest power. They've been on the scene for the longest. And so they have certain diplomatic traditions where they show that they kind of hold themselves in higher esteem than everyone else. And one of these is that they do not send out Egyptian princesses as royal marriage. They will not send an Egyptian princess to be married off to a Babylonian king. And this Babylonian king here is a little bit upset about that. And so he makes a suggestion to the Egyptian pharaoh as to how to get around that. He writes, my brother, when I wrote to you about marrying your daughter, so this is the Babylonian king writing to the Egyptian pharaoh, and he wants to marry the Egyptian pharaoh's daughter. In accordance with your practice of not giving a daughter, you wrote me saying, from time immemorial, no daughter of the king of Egypt is given to anyone. So he asked for someone in marriage. The Egyptian pharaoh said, we don't do that, remember? And so now the Babylonian king is going to give him a suggestion. He says, why not? You are a king. You do as you please. Were you to give a daughter, who would say anything? Now, since I was told of your response, I wrote as follows to you, saying, someone's grown daughters must be available. Send me a beautiful woman as if she were your daughter. Who is going to say she is not a daughter of the king? So he's saying, in my kingdom, if you send me any old Egyptian woman, no one in Babylonia is going to know it's not your daughter. So just send me anyone who looks like she could be a king's daughter, and we'll call it a deal. I can pull it off as if this is like a diplomatic alliance arranged marriage, and you don't have to violate your principles. And by far, the largest quantity of content of these is about gift giving. They send, the Egyptian pharaoh sends to the Mesopotamian kings, 300 lines worth of raw materials and objects like the jewelry that I was just showing. But the kings are often not happy with what they receive. So I give up here as one example. This is the king who is writing to the Egyptian pharaoh. And he's saying, before, in my father's reigns, we would send a messenger to you, and you would not detain him for long. You quickly sent him off, and you would also send here to my father a beautiful greeting gift. So in previous years, you treated my messengers well, and you gave me a great gift. You gave my father a great gift. But now, when I sent a messenger to you, you have detained him for 6 years, and you have sent me as my greeting gift, the only thing in 6 years, 30 minas of gold that looked like silver. So not only are you not sending me gifts enough, but you're also sending me bad gifts. I am incredibly disappointed in you. So please send me some better gifts. Later on, he goes on to complain that this ruler has just opened a new palace and had a big party, but the pharaoh was not invited. So they're also complaining when they're not invited to the party. And then they kind of passive aggressively will say, well, I'm opening my palace, and why don't you come down? I'm inviting you. So there are some serious issues that are discussed, but more often than not, the correspondence between rulers looks something like this. And we also have visual evidence for what this gift giving would have looked like. This is a wall painting from a tomb of an official from who was part of a pharaonic court, the pharaoh Thutmose III. And what is depicted on the different registers of the tomb painting is individuals coming from different lands to Egypt and bringing with them gifts for the pharaoh that they give to this vizier, this official of the pharaoh, who collects them on behalf of the pharaoh. And it's great evidence for the costume, the dress of the different peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, the raw materials that their lands produced and that they would use in these kind of economic exchanges, and also the objects that they were most associated with. So up on the first register, we have, unfortunately, I don't think you can see that, but you might be able to see in the longer profile. The first people is people from the Aegean, so the Mycenaean and Minoan world. And they have these fantastic, colorful textiles, kilts, so they wear kind of a short dress and then a bare chest. They're really colorful, highly patterned. And then they're also carrying objects, which are metal vessels made of silver and gold. And these vessels are styles that we as archaeologists actually find in the Aegean region. So we have the actual artifact, and then we can match it up to the tomb painting. They have long hair, and they don't wear beards. Down in the middle register, we have Nubians who are coming to the south of Egypt. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so now you can see up here the Aegean region. They're carrying in their hands these large metal vessels. Some of them have those copper ingots that I showed you earlier. One is holding this massive necklace, and you can see their costumes are very colorful. They were really known for their textile production. So then in the middle register, we have Nubians who are coming from the south and are bringing different sub-Saharan animals. So giraffes, there's a monkey who's climbing up the giraffe's neck. They wear short tunics made of animal skin. They have short hair. They have darker colored skin, whereas the Aegeans are always shown with like a red colored skin. And we'll often also see them carrying ebony logs. That was another major resource that Nubia would provide to other regions. And then finally, I'm going to mess up again with an image on the bottom, which is the Syrians. These two, thank you. These two registers here depict people from Syria. So that region that Egypt is really interested in conquering because of its resources and because of its key node along trade routes between the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. And they wear these long white robes. They have beards, shorter hair with a headband. And the resources that they bring are wood, so timber. They have these jars that they carry on their shoulder, which would have held olive oil or wine. And then down here, there are different types of animals. One is an elephant. There were still elephants in Syria during this time period. And sometimes they'll also bring horses and donkeys. And whenever they bring these gifts, it's a big procession in front of the pharaoh, and you deposit the gifts at their feet. The entire mission is made up of diplomats and scribes, and the whole affair is kind of a way in which the Egyptian court could see people who they did not normally see in their daily life, who are coming from different regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. So tomb paintings and texts give us evidence for the interconnectivity of this period. Another piece of fantastic evidence comes from a shipwreck. Shipwrecks are archaeologists' dreams because anything that sinks is really well preserved. It basically, after the shipwreck, it just stays on the seabed until archaeologists come and excavate it. And this example of a shipwreck is called Uluburun, the Uluburun shipwreck. It's sunk off the coast of Turkey near to a town called Kaş. And it was excavated in the 1980s. It took them about 10 years and over 20,000 dives to excavate it because you can only be underwater for so long. It was so deep underwater. And you want to excavate it meticulously and make sure that all the objects that you recover are perfectly recorded and preserved. So it was really an epic feat to excavate this. And the evidence that it gives us for Bronze Age trade is unparalleled. It transformed what we knew about the Bronze Age economy. The ship was carrying 17 tons of objects that have been identified. It could probably have held 20 tons worth of material. We think it originated, that its original port of call was in the southern Levant, somewhere like where I've put up on the map as origin point. It hugs the coast. The trade routes in the Bronze Age are going to go counterclockwise. So it starts down here in the southern Levant. It hugs the coast as it goes north, and then it hugs the Turkish coast. And based on its path, we think its original destination was intended to be Greece, to be Mycenaean Greece, based on the route and the types of objects that it was carrying. And what it was carrying was mostly raw material. So rather than finished objects, it was those resources that I said were driving trade in the period that were on the ship. And the quantity suggests that this is a royal exchange, like a really high level form of gift exchange, equivalent to what we saw in those Amarna letters, because 17 tons of objects is for one city-state, that would have been a lot. The majority of the cargo was copper. 10 tons of copper were identified on the ship, and 1 ton of tin, each in these ingot forms. So together with that ratio, we need 10 tons of copper plus 1 ton of tin to make 11 tons of bronze, which again is going to be the material used for weaponry and used for tools. And especially in Greece, there are no copper mines in that region. So they're going to be looking out towards the East Mediterranean to get that resource, to provide weaponry for their armies. Other raw materials were glass. There was about 150 of these raw glass ingots. For the copper, it's about 370, something along those lines. You could see that's what this scuba diver here is carrying up. They were stacked on the bottom of the ship. Ivory tusks, both of hippo and elephant. Ebony logs, so those logs that Nubians were carrying to deposit for the pharaoh in the tomb of Rekhmire. And then about 150 of these jars over here that look like the jars that Syrians were carrying on that tomb of Rekhmire painting. And they had terebinth resin in them, which was probably used to produce perfume. That's one of the main industries of the Mycenaean world, was the production of perfume. And this seems to have been part of a shipment for them to get access to this kind of good smelling material. In addition to the raw material, there are some objects that seem to have been possessions of the sailors on the ship, and who acted both as individuals who were navigating the ship, working the ship, and then they were also merchants on the side. So they have these dual roles. We estimate that there were 4 individuals on this ship, based on the fact that 8 sets of weights were identified, 4 of one type and 4 of another. So it seems like each merchant had 2 sets of weights, one that was in larger units, so would have been used for measuring out bulk goods like wheat, like those big jars of wine, and then a smaller set that was for more like precision, small measurements, those ones that look like small little bullets on the side. And there was also found this really unique object, which is a wooden board with ivory hinges. And in that little rectangular divot would have been placed wax, and a little stylus, a little wooden writing implement, was used to write and record the itinerary, and then also a little bit about the mercantile exchanges that they were doing on the side. One of the major cities, the major centers where all of this kind of intercultural exchange was happening, was the site of Ugarit. It was a major Mediterranean entrepot because it was located at a key node between inland routes out towards Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean Sea. It's right along the coast. And it's also right across from Cyprus, which has all of those important copper mines. And so lots of those objects that we saw in the Uluburun shipwreck are probably first coming to Ugarit, getting stored in storehouses along the coast, and then loaded onto the Uluburun shipwreck and sent up north, and continuing on their route out towards Greece. So this is where, Syrians and people from the Aegean and people from Egypt are all meeting together in the side alleys of Ugarit. Not all of them are going to be speaking the same language. They all have their own individual dialects. Ugarit is unique, where we have archives in 8 different languages recovered from here. They speak a language called Ugaritic, but we have evidence for Akkadian and the Cypriot language, Cypro-Minoan, all in private archives and also palatial archives. That's another unique thing about Ugarit, is that we get a lot of evidence for what the life of a merchant was like. Whereas at Amarna, we're looking at the Pharaoh's archive. Here we have the houses and the archives of people who are on those ships, like Uluburun, the merchants who are investing in the ships and manning them and making a profit off things on the side as they're traveling around the Eastern Mediterranean. It also gives interesting evidence for different religious practices. These are 2 representations of deities that were recovered from the site of Ugarit. The smiting god over here is typical of Cypriot and Syrian deities. And then this ivory head over here is completely unique from a temple context at the site. So we have raw materials, we have like upper level exchange between pharaohs, and then we have this mercantile kind of just below royal level interconnectivity in the Bronze Age. And so I wanted to talk a little bit just about how my research touches upon some of these issues of interconnectivity in the late Bronze Age. So shifting to the periphery of the East Mediterranean to the area of Greece, I've been lucky to be a part of an excavation at a site called Pylos, which has one of those major linear beat archives. It was a major Mycenaean palace. And recently we have been excavating the areas outside of the palace, and we discovered a number of burials, which were recently displayed at the Getty Museum. The exhibit just closed last week, but the finds will be displayed in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And some of the finds that we recovered are transforming what we know about late Bronze Age trade networks. So these are 3 objects that were identified in what we call a tholos tomb. So just to go back for a second, this is what a tholos tomb looks like. So it's a big communal burial for one family group, stone structure, circular, built above ground, big monument in the landscape. Unfortunately, because it is such a big monument, it's been known, it would have stood out in antiquity. People had kind of already come through and disturbed it. But we did still find some small objects like the ones that I show up here. So we have this amphora that would have held that terebinth brazen, kind of that material on the Uluburun shipwreck used to hold things for perfume making. Down here is a glass bead that comes from the area of Mesopotamia, and it has this star symbol that was associated in Mesopotamia with the goddess Ishtar. But the find that was the most unique, and that I really like to highlight because it shows how the complexity of interaction in the East Mediterranean during this time period, are these 2 earrings up here, which have a gold base. This is the back of the piece, and this is the front of the piece. So it's the same object. We did find 2 of them. They're earrings. They have a gold back, and then they're made using the cloisonne technique, which is with gold wiring. So the gold wiring base, and then in between the gold wiring were placed all kinds of precious metals. So lapis lazuli, hard stones, like turquoise, faience, glass. And what's so unique about this piece, in addition to its artistic beauty, they're about this big, I should say. So they're really big for earrings, is that they depict an Egyptian goddess, the goddess Hathor, who's always shown with cow ears. She's the goddess of fertility. She's the goddess of motherhood, the goddess of the sky. But it depicts an Egyptian goddess, but it was actually produced in Lebanon. It's produced in the city of Byblos, depicts an Egyptian goddess, and then is exported to Greece, where it is buried with a Greek family. So it has a really fascinating object life story. I don't have too much time to talk about our other finds, but I would be happy to talk about them after the lecture. So that's one project that I work on. Another project that I work on is at a Syrian palace and city, a city that was called Achana. Today we call the site, the city was called Alalak. Today we call the site Tel Achana. It is located in southern Turkey today. It was culturally Syrian in the Bronze Age. But you can see that actually at New Year's, it snowed there on the palace, which is pretty unheard of. And it's a city like Ugarit, so one of those major entrepôts that is on an important trade route between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. It is getting imports from all over the Eastern Mediterranean. It gets Egyptian objects, it gets Hittite objects. And it's at that boundary where the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire are constantly fighting. They want control of this territory, and so they're always in tension. But the reason that I'm doing research there is because they cut a bunch of imports from the Mycenaean world, from the Greek world. Greece is sending out pottery vessels to all over the Levant, especially this site in Syria called Alalak. And what they're sending is painted pottery. It's this bright reddish brown color, which really would have stood out on a Syrian table because their pottery is totally plain. And they're sending these two vessels, what we call a flask and a stirrup jar, not just because of the color of the pottery, not just because it has kind of like, it's really, really hard fired. So it's almost like porcelain. Like when you drop it, it makes kind of this clangy sound. But they're exporting it not just because of the material, but also because of the contents. So both of these vessels would have held perfumed oil, what that terebinth was being sent to the Aegean world to produce. So it's an oil-based perfume with plant material steeped in it. It's bottled up into these vessels and then exported by a ship all the way out to this site in Syria. You can see that this is kind of the museum piece. When I'm studying it, that's usually what I find. So just kind of the top, and then I have to extrapolate that it comes from a bigger vessel. So one thing they're exporting is the perfume itself, but they're also exporting vessels like this one that are just being sent out for their beauty and for being a pot, not for its contents, but just for the actual pot itself. This vessel is called a crater. It was used for mixing wine with water, so diluting your wine at a dinner party. It's about this big, so it'd be kind of at the center of the table when you're hosting a small gathering for your friends and drinking and serving your wine. And on these vessels are depicted images, especially scenes of chariots and charioteers. That's what you see on this one. But sometimes there's depictions of acrobatics, there's scenes of feasting, there's octopi, which is what the one that I'm holding in my hand is a little fragment of the tentacles of an octopus from a vessel like that. And one thing that's really fascinating is that these objects, we never find them in Greece. They are produced exclusively for export. So they are produced in Greece, but they're only being sent out to the Levant for these consumers at Alalak who want to host a dinner party with a vessel that looks like this. So the Mycenaeans are really being savvy merchants here. They're producing certain types of pottery that they know will sell well in different regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, but not actually using them themselves. The Mycenaeans were not the only ones who were doing this. The Cypriots do it as well. So at the site that I work at, we also get tons of pottery that looks like this, which was produced in Cyprus. Some of them are bowls for eating, but a lot of them, like these vessels over here, were also perfumes. So there's a kind of a big perfume industry across the Eastern Mediterranean with a lot of competing producers, both those in Greece and then also those in Cyprus and also in the Levant itself. So far, I've kind of been talking about peaceful interconnection, trade, exchange, raw materials. But we also have warfare during this time period. And we have kind of the earliest evidence for a peace treaty, which comes out of the Battle of Kadesh between the Hittite and the Egyptian army. And actually, a copy of this treaty is on display at the UN today to kind of trace back the history of diplomacy. The Battle of Kadesh was fought between the Hittite army and the Egyptian army. They're both competing to control this Levantine region. And the border between the two empires has historically, for at this point, let's say like 30, 40, 50 years, been at a city called Kadesh, marked on the map here. But the Hittites are getting rather greedy. They want to expand their territory in the Levant. They want to control more of these city-states. And so the Hittite emperor, Muwatalli II, very not an easy name to say, I know, he takes his army, which is going to be a mix of cavalry, charioteers, infantrymen, and he starts moving into Egyptian territory. The Egyptian army, under Pharaoh Ramses II, meets them in the area of Kadesh, and they fight a battle with many, many casualties. In total, both armies are going to have about 30,000 troops or so, and many of them, according to the narrative that we get, died in the course of the battle. The battle ends in a stalemate. Neither army really comes out on top, although the Egyptian pharaoh, in his own testimony to his people, likes to make out that he was victorious, but we know that it ended in a stalemate, and eventually the negotiation of this treaty, called the Treaty of Kadesh, that stipulated the end of this war, and also essentially said that the boundaries between the two empires would stay the same, that Kadesh would be the boundary between the Hittite and the Egyptian army going forward. Okay, so we have this interconnected world, Mesopotamia, the Hittites, Egypt, all trading, exchanging things like the we find on the Uluburun shipwreck, and also small things like the pottery that I study. But this world comes to a very dramatic and sudden collapse around 1200 BC, when there are destructions at cities across the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite capital of Hattusha, which is, you see its lion gates up in the right corner, it is burnt to the ground and abandoned. Many of the Mycenaean palaces, like Mycenae and Pylos, are also burnt to the ground and abandoned. That city of Ugarit, this impressive Mediterranean entrepot, suffers the same fate, burnt, abandoned. And these regions stay depopulated for many hundreds of years afterwards, with people moving to different regions and establishing new cities. Writing disappears in certain regions, like the Mycenaean palaces, that linear B script disappears. The prestige goods that were being produced using all of those raw materials on the Uluburun shipwreck stop being made. Palaces are no longer decorated with wall paintings, with monumental sculpture. Those gold pieces of jewelry, no longer produced. The only empires that don't suffer this fate is really Egypt. Egypt is kind of the only one that is still standing, and even they are retracting. They're not the power that they used to be. And the question is, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And unfortunately, the answer is that we don't really have great evidence for what brought everything down. But we have a couple of guesses. So what happens in the aftermath is that we no longer have empires besides Egypt. There's a lot of fragmentation, much smaller states. There's no figural pottery, no figural art. It's all totally geometric, like the pot that you see up here. And we have the invention of a new technology, which is iron. Whereas bronze is the metal that is driving trade, that is going to be used for your weaponry. In this following period, so after 1200 BC, iron appears for weaponry. And that kind of a little bit acts like a leveling force. You're no longer so reliant upon Cyprus and those copper ores because iron is available in more regions of the Mediterranean. It requires much higher temperatures so it requires a new technology to produce. But once you have those high temperatures, it's more easily accessible. Okay, so how did we get from kind of Bronze Age lots of trade and exchange, to a bunch of isolated, smaller political units in the Iron Age. Well, our greatest hint comes from Egypt, where we have this depiction. This is a drawing of a stone relief carving made on a mortuary temple, a temple in Egypt for the pharaoh Ramses III. And on this image, he depicts himself, always shown way larger than everyone else. He's this figure on the far right with the bow and arrow. And on the far left are his enemies. So he is defeating enemies that in the inscriptions he describes as a group of bands, several bands of tribes who are coming from islands, from regions in the sea. And he writes in his inscription that these sea peoples, the sea peoples is a modern term that we give to them. He lists kind of individual tribe names. And he says that they invaded Egypt from the delta. So they came from the sea through to the northern Egypt part. They attacked Egypt, that they had already attacked other regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. They had already attacked the Hittites, that they had already attacked the Levant. And then they made their way to Egypt and they tried to defeat Egypt. But Ramses III, our big heroic figure over here, turned them back and prevented Egypt from suffering their same fate. So I'm going to show you kind of specifically what he says. And then he also depicts them. These are images of these different sea peoples with all kinds of different costumes. They're not a unified army. They have all of these kind of different hairstyles, different weaponry. They're also not just males. There's women and children. So there are families who are migrating as well. It's not just kind of like an organized army. And we don't hear of any king. There's no leader of the sea peoples mentioned in these texts. But what he does say is that the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. So he's very specific that they come from island places. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Kati, that's Hatti, so the Hittites. Kode Carchemish, Carchemish is in southern Turkey. Arzawa, a part of western Turkey, and Elashia, Cyprus. So all of those regions, it says, fell at the hands of the sea people. A camp was set up in one place in Amaru, so in Syria. So the army sets up a camp in the region of the Levant. They desolated its people and its lands, so it destroys Syria as well. And then they were coming forward towards Egypt. So they've destroyed all of these places, and then they're moving towards Egypt. So this is the drawing of it. And this is actually the Temple of Menenhapu itself in a much younger version of me in front of it. And then Ramses III tells us a little bit about who these people are. He describes them as a confederation of different tribes, and he gives us their names. He calls them the Peliset, the Jeker, the Shekelesh, the Danana, the Weshesh, so he gives names of different lands. And linguistic analysis suggests, and kind of the depictions that we see, the different costumes that they show, and comparing that to iconography we have of other regions, suggests that the Peliset is the Philistines, so a group of people who will rule the southern Levant in the Iron Age. The Shekelesh, perhaps the Sicilians in an island area. And the Danana is perhaps a group called the Danites, which is how the poet Homer refers to the Greeks in his poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So perhaps some people from the region of Greece, and all of these bands are coming together and attacking Egypt. Now, Egypt had already known of these groups of individuals before they kind of attacked. Some of them, like the Shekelesh, had acted as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. So these were people who were familiar to the Egyptians before, and they're wearing all kinds of different armor, as I said. This one here has a circular shield and a horned helmet, whereas these ones over here, the Peliset, have more of like a fringed headdress. Some other possible explanations, in addition to the sea people, paleontological analysis suggests that this is a period of drought. There have been droughts, across the Bronze Age, so that alone should not be the singular factor. But it probably would have caused a lot of people to move, could have caused internal rebellions within these city-states. So drought is probably also a contributor. In the Mycenaean world, it seems also like internal rebellion against the palatial states. We have earthquakes too. and the invasion of the Sea Peoples. Together, these kind of created like a perfect storm, a multiplier effect of causes that contributed to the collapse, this very sudden collapse of the Bronze Age. But it is kind of an unsatisfying end. We don't 100% know. It's kind of amazing, in fact, that we don't really know exactly how this massive citadel at Hattusha that controlled a massive empire in Anatolia suddenly burnt to the ground in one instance. So with that, that's all that I have for you. But I'm really happy to take any questions that you have about my own work or about the Eastern Mediterranean and its Bronze Age.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Questions and discussion. Tom.
Yes.
I think my first interest was probably just watching a documentary in high school. She asked how I first became interested in this topic. And I think in my high school class, I just watched a documentary on it and had a side interest. And then I went to university and discovered that people actually study this thing, like that there's something that I could not just read a book about, but actually actively investigate. So I think that's kind of my original, but so even I sometimes have a hard time remembering how I got into it.
With increased travel and trade between the countries, is there any evidence that what happens later, of course, that diseases and epidemics which are traded back and forth could collapse an epidemic with high mortality and et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for this time period, no, we don't have any evidence of epidemics, but a little bit earlier, when looking at especially the Minoan period, which is kind of the earlier part of the late Bronze Age, like 1500 BC, Egyptian texts record a Cretan plague that they describe, and they record spells that are supposed to help you against the Cretan plague. So there we might have an epidemic. One of the problems is that for that time period, one of the ways that we could use kind of scientific analyses to study if there was a plague or not would be through bones. And we have very little burials of that time period, which makes it hard for us to get evidence to corroborate that. So for the later part of the late Bronze Age, no evidence for epidemics yet, but a little bit earlier in the late Bronze Age, yes. That's a great question. Thank you.
An Egyptian archaeologist that we heard a lecture from a month ago or so mentioned also smallpox in Egypt. Plague and smallpox.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
I noticed the earrings that you had shown, they were made in Byblos, you said.
Yes.
Have you been in Byblos?
I have not been. I would love to, but I have not been. Have you?
Because that's a wonderful place. It's a historian fantasy place, because you can stand in this Crusader castle scanning your eye from a Bronze Age site to a 19th century Ottoman Turkish building.
Yep.
And then also some of the earliest examples of Phoenician alphabetic writing I've seen this came from Byblos and is in the museum in Beirut.
Yes, the Byblos alphabet is fantastic, and everything that you said is exactly what got me interested in archaeology. I love that, being able to see a Crusader castle and the remains from 20th century. And
it'd be a fantasy for you.
Yep, exactly. So I would love to go someday, hopefully.
I wonder how often you or colleagues get questions about whether these objects, so many of which are available to see in the great museums of the world, are art as well as historical data and artifacts. And I always am intrigued by asking myself that question when I'm in a great museum and looking at some of this art from this objects from this period.
That is a fantastic question. And we don't have any texts that attest to their attitude towards it. Definitely in Egypt, it's kind of more of like historical documentation and more political communication venue considered rather than art. And there's very little stylistic change through time. For the Aegean, it's harder to say because we don't have the textual evidence for their attitudes toward it. Another big question also is narrative, like with these figural depictions on walls and the pottery that I was showing with the charioteers. Are they trying to tell a story? Are they trying to tell a myth? Or is this kind of a genre scene? With the pottery that I was showing, because the iconography is so similar, in that case, it seems to be more of a genre scene. But one of our fascinating finds from the site of Pylos is a seal stone, so like about this big, that depicts a warrior defeating another one, and then a third warrior on the ground. And the way that the scene is composed really does make you think of epic and like a Homeric battle scene that it's very hard to prove, but could be representations of poetry and narrative and stories that are circulating. Yeah, it's a really, really great question.
So then there's no record of any literature that you're talking about, is that right?
So in Egypt and at Ugarit and in the Hittite world, Mesopotamian world, yes, there is literature. And there's epic tales like the Tale of Wenamun, which tells of kind of an odyssey of this Egyptian diplomat as he circles around the Eastern Mediterranean. So in Egypt, we do have literature. In Greece, we don't have literature. The only documentation that we have is just all these taxation receipts. And we can tell a little bit about religion. They talk about gods. They have the Olympian gods already at this time period. So Zeus and Poseidon appear in those texts, but no myths. Yeah. Yes.
During this time period, are all of these various empires slave-based economies? And how much evidence is there of trading slaves?
So in Egypt, it's kind of corvée labor in that you work for the pharaoh, but in return you get like housing and your meals paid for and things like that. So at the pyramids or in the Valley of the Kings, there are towns for the laborers who are working on these monuments, temporary towns when they're working. In the Mycenaean world, we do. There again, it's kind of a similar system. They live in the palace, they work in the perfume industry, they work as scribes, and there we have evidence for people who are coming from the site of Miletus, which is on the western Turkish coast, and then being, moving to Greece. So there is some evidence for the exchange of peoples, not just in diplomatic marriages, but also like on a lower labor level. Yeah, great question.
It's rather interesting that sometime after the Sea Peoples sort of attacked all these places, there was a large Mycenaean migration. And the Mycenaeans basically occupied all the islands of the Mediterranean from Crete going to the coast of Turkey, where Greek peoples live today. What was the impetus for that?
So I think, in the late Bronze Age, so before the collapse, there's Mycenaean, things that look kind of like Mycenaean colonies in the islands and on the western Turkish coast. After the collapse, the same thing happens that does in the Mycenaean palaces, where we don't anymore have kind of this production of Mycenaean style goods. So it's not that the Mycenaeans outlasted the collapse, but it is true that we get Greek style pottery being produced in the Levant after the collapse and on Cyprus. And so it does seem like people are migrating as either part of the Sea Peoples or other population movements out of the Greece to the Levant as part of this broader migration that brought in people from the Western Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean. And as the bands are getting bigger, more and more people are probably joining. I should also mention that Ramses III says that he settled the Sea Peoples, that after they invaded Egypt, he establishes kind of a settlement in the northern delta where the Sea Peoples are going to live now that he's kind of turned them out.
There's growing modern literature associating the people that the Bible disparagingly refers to as Philistines were actually Mycenaean Greeks.
Yeah, with Cretans in particular. Yes.
Did you raise your hand? No.
curious about the glass production. They all had sand, so why was it all coming from Nubia? And did they remelt it, or did it come as ingots?
So it came as ingots and then remelted. This is a great question that I also don't fully understand why everyone has sand. So why are they importing it? It might be that they didn't realize that they're just importing it and don't really realize the technology behind it. So glass is invented in Egypt and they're kind of the original exporter, but then it becomes a major industry in Syria. Tons and tons of glass production in those city states like Al-Alaq that I work at, that they're then exporting out to Greece and other regions. So it's a great question that I don't really have the answer to, but I suspect that they didn't know that sand is kind of the technology that you needed to use. And it takes a higher temperature. Yeah. So originally faience is the first, is kind of the first glass, like vitreous material that's produced in the Mediterranean, slightly like 100 years before glass is then invented and circulates around.
I have a question about the earrings that you discovered. And you mentioned that they had the Egyptian goddess on the back, and yet they were used for burial in Greece. And I'm just curious, what do you make of that? Were people practicing other religions in other places, or what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating question that we're still trying to investigate, because it's also interesting that in that same tomb, there's this glass bead of Ishtar, another female goddess. And they're kind of the only Levantine Eastern imports that we have from the site in the time period. And so it's really fascinating that they're associated with a female goddess and they're occurring together in this burial. In terms of worship of deities from other regions, we don't have a whole lot of evidence either for like temple sanctuaries. I guess in the Levant, I study some sites where there's Mycenaean pottery that's deposited as offerings to deities who are not Mycenaean, but that could just be, that doesn't mean that's a Mycenaean Greek who is worshiping a different deity. It could just be an import that's dedicated. The texts, they're all Greek specific deities who are mentioned as getting offerings in textual evidence. Hathor is often also more associated with kind of the domestic side. So it could kind of be more of like a household worship as well that we wouldn't get evidence for. It's a great question. Thank you.
So what I'm surmising here is that there's really no connection with any area outside the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's like with China or with Europe or anything else like that. And I just wonder if you found anything at all that might link that region that you've discussed with any areas further away. And a second thing, have you ever found any maps of any kind in any of the archaeological ruins that you've explored or anybody else has explored?
Both great questions. So I'll answer the first one first. No discovery of maps, unfortunately. And for navigation purposes, that's also a question of how they're navigating without maps. We have one artifact from this tomb that could be a compass, potentially. Second question about interconnection with other parts of the world. So in these tombs, we also get amber, which is coming from the Baltic. There's some evidence for connection out west with Britain. They have another kind of tin deposit, so some of the tin might be coming from out that way. Mycenaean pottery also appears in Sardinia and southern Italy quite a lot during this time period. So they're exporting not just to the east, but also out west. In terms of China, no evidence for connection between China and the Eastern Mediterranean. The farthest east would be Afghanistan with those lapis lazuli deposits and also the tin deposits, and perhaps some with India, perhaps, but that's very, very tenuous evidence.
Yeah, simultaneously, I guess, with the Bronze Age, there was a similar civilization in the Indus Valley of what we now call Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Would you care to comment about that?
I am definitely not an expert on that. So if you have any comments that you want to add, like the Harappan, you mean?
I remember just recently I read an article about ancient DNA study of the human remains from Egypt about 3000 BC, this person had a recent ancestor from the Tigris Euphrates area.
Mhm.
So there definitely was a lot of population migration and mixing. Any other questions, comments, discussion? Nope. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.